Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Katie from A Natter About Books, and today I wanted to talk to you about the different non-fiction books that I love. So these are the ones that I have kept on my shelves for, in some instances, a few years because I would never be able to part with them. These are the ones that have actually really stuck with me. Sometimes I can read non-fiction and feel like there are things that I've picked up from it, but sometimes it's just a little bit boring, the subject matter doesn't interest me very much, or the author doesn't cover it in a style that I particularly respond to or find accessible. So I wanted to share with you today the non-fiction books that have really stuck with me, whether that be because they are hilariously funny, I really like the subject matter, or the way that the author covers it. So there are a few that I wanted to share with you today, some of which are autobiographies, some of them focus on a specific topic such as race or feminism. So let's get started. Also, a bit of a preface before I go into showing you all of these books. I'm showing you them because I really like them and I would recommend them all, which is why I'm not going to finish every single one saying that I love them and recommend them. Just take that as a given. That is why I'm sharing them with you today. And also I find that I say that after every single book anyway, so just to vary it up a little bit, I'm not going to say that. So two books that I wanted to start with are Adam Kay's works. We've got This Is Going to Hurt, published in 2017, and we've got 'Twas the Night Shift Before Christmas, which was published 2 years later in 2019. Adam Kay was a junior doctor and has since left the profession to become a comedian, which is why these are very, very funny. They're a funny representation of his time as a junior doctor. Both of these are written in the form of diary entries. I'm only going to hold one. They do the same thing, except one is at Christmas. This one actually heavily focuses on his time in the maternity ward. That was the way that his career was going as a junior doctor. So this heavily focuses on that time in his life. As I said, it is ridiculously funny. It's also very educational. There are some asides that you get in this, where he goes into a little bit more context around medical jargon that's used. There are some elements in here that he makes completely accessible, but he still keeps it quite high level, easy to understand, but very informative. There are also some really heart-wrenching moments in here. For example, it shows his relationship with his wife and how he often has to miss out on Christmases and birthdays because he is working at the hospital and they obviously need him for the shift. And obviously alongside that there are lots of things that happen to his patients and how that then has an impact on him. And yeah, so I just thought that this was so accessible. Both of these were so accessible, and I just really liked the humour behind them as well. Next we have Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This one was published in 2016 and it was actually winner of the National Book Award, as you can see there, and it was a #1 New York Times bestseller as well. So this one is very well known. This is written in the form of letters to Coates' son and tries to explain the story of the black body, which has gone through such exploitation through the forms of slavery and segregation, and how this has transformed into a society where young black people or black people of all ages are threatened, locked up and killed in the streets as well. So this is a really powerful exploration of the history of black men, black women. This stems from Coates' childhood all the way through to university, through to his adulthood, and how he has been subjected to different forms of racism, and how people that he's known have been subjected to different forms of racism as well. This also is quite heart-wrenching when he talks about people that he knew whilst he was a child and kids themselves, how they've grown up to be murdered in the streets and how they've been subjected to such racism. And it really puts the spotlight on how the world is still far away from the reform that needs to happen. So this does focus on Coates' personal narrative, interwoven with his past, the present, and also how he would propose a brighter future moving forwards, especially for society and his son, who will be growing up in that society as well. So this, I think, was really important. I listened to this on audiobook the first time, but I would strongly recommend actually reading it in physical form, because this was so empowering to actually to read in short bursts. I found that picking it up and just reading through a chapter of Coates's life and how that has impacted him, I thought that this was very important. So I would encourage anyone to read this if they haven't. Next, we have Eat, Sweat, Play by Anna Kessel, How Sport Can Change Our Lives. This is one that I come back to year and year again. It was originally published in, I think, 2016, and I bought this initially and read it within my 3rd year of university, where I didn't even like going for a walk to the shop, let alone moving my body and exercising in the way that I probably should have been and should have enjoyed doing. The only thing, you know, that I was pushing my body to the limits of was how many potatoes that I could eat in a meal. So this came at the right time for me in my life, I have to say. First saw Lena Norms mention this on her channel a few years ago, and I was looking for something that, like I said, would motivate me to actually get up and move my body. But also because I was doing my degree at the time, my main focus in literature was feminism. My key interests kind of linked up with this. I wanted to be motivated about sport, but also understand how this links with gender and feminism and all sorts of things like that. So this does exactly that. This focuses on the gendering of sport and how fitness is intrinsically deemed as an unfeminine thing, or if we look at a fit woman or women in sport, we immediately consider them to be quite masculine. It's not something that is feminine unless we stereotype things like ballet, for example. We look at, say, female footballers and we immediately presume that they are masculine women. This also is really important because it looks at how in your childhood and as a young girl you're encouraged to do things like get outside, roll down hills, climb up trees and do all sorts with your body and move it in a way that as you grow up, society then deems it to be not as important. There is less and less emphasis on having fun with your body, and instead is changed into lose weight, conform to the different ways that society is telling you to conform. You need to be skinny, you need to be this and that. This also has interviews with lots of different women in the public eye in relation to sport. So for example, Sporty Spice is interviewed in this. So for anyone that likes the Spice Girls, definitely pick this up. And it also talks about how they have had experiences with sport in the past and how they have been represented in the media for being masculine because they are sporty. So it's a really interesting look at gender within the sporting world. Like I said, this is one that I find myself coming back to year on year. If you're looking for a way of understanding sport a little bit more for people that completely don't really get involved with sport, much like myself, this is a really interesting read. And if there's one book that I would recommend that you take away from this video, it's this one. I love this. I told you that I wouldn't say that, but I'm making an exception for that one because it's my fave. The next is Jon Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed. This was published, I think, in 2015. I read this a few years ago, so my memory is a little bit hazy on this one, but I just remember putting it down and thinking, gosh, I don't quite know how I feel about it, but I really enjoyed it. So this heavily focuses on the concept of cancel culture, which I wouldn't have thought was around as much in 2015, that being, well, 6 years ago now, which is insane. I think this was initially intended to be spoken about in relation to things like if someone tweets something a little bit irresponsible or something that they definitely wouldn't have said in public, having that form of communication out to the outside world so quickly, how that then has an impact on someone if they say the wrong thing and their platform and their audience actually comes back for them and calls them out on it. So this is about how Jon Ronson is trying to make a decision as to whether the people that have been publicly shamed, whether they deserve that shame. There was a section in this that I found particularly interesting about feedback loops and how, for example, if you were, say, driving in a built-up area and you went over the speed limit by 2 miles an hour and you've got a little light that flashes on the road that says you're going too quickly, please slow down, and you immediately rectify that. You decide to slow down because that is what you are meant to do, and you have been told immediately that that is something that you need to do. So because you've seen that, you then react to it and you amend. When it comes to cancel culture and being publicly shamed, the interesting thing is that you have put, say, a tweet in this example out to hundreds, thousands, oftentimes millions of people if we're looking at the big celebrities. And we can see that people initially cling to what has been said, and you've got people that tend to strongly agree with you and some people that strongly disagree with what you've said, and then how, if it's the latter, you can actually be subjected to a lot of judgment because people have disagreed with what you've said. Now, in some instances, this is obviously because something has been said that is ridiculous, it defies all sense, in which case, is that okay for people to kind of jump on that and subject the person that has said those things to hatred, which is pretty much what it is. And so I think the idea of a feedback loop is really interesting, because if it's happened immediately and people are jumping on you and saying, you know, you really shouldn't have said that, and explaining why you're wrong, it leads the question as to whether you would have said it in a public setting, whether you're willing to accept that because it was on such a public platform, you have to take responsibility for what was said. So I think this is a very interesting concept of a book. I think it could probably do with a bit of a refresh now because of everything else that's happened in the world. And I think it's one that I would like to go back to at some point as well, because like I said, there are some interesting concepts, but because I haven't read this in a couple of years, I think there's a lot of things that I've probably forgotten about it that would be quite interesting to read again. Next, we have Breaking and Mending by Joanna Cannon. This was published last year, back in 2020, and this was one of my favourite reads of last year, I have to admit. Joanna Cannon is one of my favourite authors of all time. I consider her to be one of the coziest authors I have ever read, in that, you know, I pick up a book and want to get all cozy with a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate. Not as in she's a cozy person, I don't know her. But from reading her previous two fiction works, so we've got Three Things About Elsie and The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, this was quite an interesting, pretty much tangent for her. So this focuses again on her time as a junior doctor, much like Adam Kay's work. This isn't quite as funny, but it's much more heartbreaking. You see all of the different elements of her life on the lead up to her decision to become a junior doctor, how she did it quite later on in her life, and therefore was the oldest person in her year, and obviously it retells of her experiences working in the wards as well. You also get to see how her opinions about the job changes, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because obviously I want you to read it, but it's quite interesting how you see her feelings towards being a doctor changes, how that impacted her future decisions in her life. But I really did enjoy this. I thought that this was a really interesting and different read from Joanna Cannon. It was lovely to hear more about her as a person as well. So if you have liked her previous two fiction novels, I would recommend picking this up, because it is really lovely to hear a little bit more about the background of the authors that you love. So yeah. Next, we have I Call Myself a Feminist. This is written by 25 women under 30. So this was published in 2015 and comprises of the justification as to why 25 women under 30 believe themselves to be feminists and therefore call themselves as such. This features chapters from Laura Bates, Louise O'Neill, Reniero Lodge, who I'll be mentioning in a moment, and it has a variety of women, so women from different social classes and backgrounds, different races and ethnicities as well. It's really interesting because you hear from so many different perspectives the reasons as to why they have become feminists or why it was intrinsically ingrained in them from their childhood. This is also a really nice read because it's interspersed with quotes from different people in the public eye. So you've got people like Mindy Kaling, for example. Types of women in romantic comedies who are not real. The skinny woman who is beautiful and toned but also gluttonous and disgusting, for example. So there are elements in here that's interspersed because it can get quite heavy at times because it's written from so many different backgrounds. You've got chapters on the Human Rights Act by Rosie Brighouse. So for our children, for our mothers, for all still struggling, we must save the Human Rights Act. Reniero Lodge writes, what can men do to support feminism? You've got Islam is My Feminism and Feminism is My Islam by Maisa Haig, I think. Could have said that wrong. I think that this is a really interesting collection of different women's thoughts and feelings around feminism and why they consider themselves to be feminists. Next, we have The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry. So Grayson Perry is a British potter who became famous when he won the Turner Prize back in 2003. But he remained in the public eye because of controversy around being a cross-dresser. He has since made documentaries. He's written several autobiographies about the meaning of gender and how men conform to this ideology. For example, one of the television documentaries that he made was called Why Men Wear Frocks, and it's all about how men decide to dress up as women on some occasions and why society then believes that that is wrong, whereas perhaps in the same respect a woman wouldn't be in the public eye for dressing like a man. So you get lots of interesting representation in this as well. So this explores the meaning of gender and how people conform to the ideals that society have put in place. So on the flip side of I call myself a feminist, this explores the male gender and how they are told that when they're younger they shouldn't cry or show their emotions, to always be the breadwinner of the family, how these societal norms are deeply ingrained within a young man's life and how he then goes on to live his life with those thoughts in the back of his head. So this builds on his documentary and explores his childhood and personal history whilst questioning why men are pressured to conform to these ideals that everyone knows. So I really enjoyed this because it's a really interesting exploration of gender. It's one that I would like to reread because I read this in my third year of university, so that was almost 4 years ago now, so it's one that I would love to get back to at some point. There are just so many good books and not enough time in my life to read them all. So yeah. Then we have Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. This was initially published in 2017. This got a lot of traction when it was initially published and was actually based around a blog post that Rennie made back in 2016 under the same name, which actually had quite a lot of backlash. And this piece went viral and actually highlighted the structural and institutionalized racism that is still apparent day to day in this country and around the world. And obviously this was pushed to the forefront of everyone's minds again last year with the Black Lives Matter movement. Everyone was talking about this because it deals with so many different aspects of racism so accessibly and interestingly. I really would recommend this if you haven't read it. I listened to this on audiobook the first time that I did, and I really appreciated the range of topics that were covered in this. It wasn't just about racism as a concept, and it looks at wider topics such as whitewashing feminism, the impact of class on race, and also the eradication of Black history as well. I really found this so intriguing when I was reading about it, and obviously it is horrific in places because you just hear about things that have happened, and I wanted to make sure that I was as educated as I could be, have a conversation around racism and Black Lives Matter movement. I read this initially when it came out, and I also read it again last year, and I think it's a really important piece of writing that, like I said, if you haven't read, definitely pick it up because it highlights so many key areas that I think a lot of people forget about, and just talk about racism as a whole. They don't look at all of the little things that are impacted in this world because of it. Really do think that this is an important read. And last but by no means least is Living Better, How I Learned to Survive Depression by Alistair Campbell, or Campbell. This was published last year in 2020, and I think it was delayed because of coronavirus. At the end there's an additional chapter around how life has impacted the publication of this book and also mental health. Yes, this covers the key areas in Alistair Campbell's life that has influenced his depression and how he's learned to cope and live with mental health issues since he was a child. Alistair Campbell's most well known for being Tony Blair's spokesman and strategist whilst he was at Downing Street. He's also an ambassador for mental health charities, so He has been in the public eye a lot in relation to his personal mental health, and how he has been working with charities to help support others that need it. There are a few references within this to a scale that Alistair uses to identify how his mental health is on any given day. So 1 would be that he is feeling perfectly fine, and 10 would be on the complete other end of the scale where he is feeling suicidal. That's the worst that he could possibly feel. And the different events within Alistair's life cause him to fluctuate on that scale, and this is how he then tells you how he copes with all of these different things, the people that he's spoken to, the different treatments that he's had in his life. And I think that it's a really important read for anyone that has struggled with their mental health in the past, because it comes up with methods and ways that you can try and process and deal with anything that's happened that has caused your mental health to deteriorate. This also has a really interesting concept that you can actually see in an excerpt of at the very end, called the jam jar method, where you can build your own jam jar. I won't go into too much detail about it. You can give it a Google if that's something that you're interested in and you are looking for methods of coping with mental health. But it's all to do with how you initially put in the things that are always going to remain, so nothing that's ever going to fall through the cracks of the jam jar. You've got things like your jeans that go in at the bottom, then you've got things that go on top of that, such as key elements in your life like the people, your dog, all of the different things that impact you, your job for example, and then on top of that you've got things that tend to fall through the cracks of those things. So like I said, it's a really interesting method of dealing with depression and taking count of everything within your life, and serves as a really helpful reminder of things that sometimes you would forget about if you are spiraling into a depressive episode, for example. I actually spent quite a long time reading this. I read it over the course of a few months because I found that if you just sit and read the whole thing in one go, there are elements of it that do get quite heavy, so there's probably a little bit of a trigger warning for alcoholism and obviously depression and mental health issues as well, and things like death and suicide are also mentioned in this, so just tread with caution if that's anything that could trigger you, but I do think it's a really important read as well. So those were some of my favourite non-fiction reads that I have read over the past few years, some of which I would really like to get back to, but like I said, there are so many books and so little time, and obviously there are new ones coming out all the time, so I want to make sure that I'm reading them. So hopefully there are a few in there that you think would be interesting reads for you. If you enjoyed, please like this video and subscribe. I'd really like to hear any non-fiction recommendations that you have in the comments below, and would love to talk to you if you've read any of these books. Just drop a comment and we'll have a chat. And yeah, thank you all for watching, and I will speak to you again very soon. Thank you. Bye.